Sarah, I want to go to this issue, particularly in your region area of Geelong. There's been a cluster of youth suicides. You and I both personally know families hit hard here, and you have raised it. You've sought exemptions in the past for funerals and things like that from the authorities in Victoria. I have to say, you have been knocked back. I haven't seen enough compassion in this case from the Victorian government. How can we walk the walk here rather than just talk about mental health and all these announcements, millions of dollars? If we've got cases like this in Perth, what can we do more on the ground?
Well, Peta, good evening. Great to join you. And yes, mental health is always a very serious issue, but even more so during the pandemic. And as you mentioned, we've had a really serious situation in the Geelong region where 5 wonderful young men have taken their own lives. And that has caused so much grief. And I discovered, in fact, that despite the incredible resources that we are putting into headspace, into mental health prevention, into mental health research, and in fact, Greg Hunt made another fantastic announcement today, there are still people falling through the gaps. And in Victoria and in our region, there's no youth beds. They're called prevention and recovery care beds. So this missing middle of mental health services in Victoria, as identified by the Royal Commission, is an absolutely massive issue. And while there are these called youth park beds in Melbourne and Ballarat, there are none in the Geelong region. And I have been crying out for this investment for some 12 months. Peter, and it is absolutely shocking that we haven't seen any agreement by the state government to provide what is a relatively small amount of funding to make sure that we can have these resources.
Sarah, you said young men. I know. We're talking about teenagers here. We're talking about boys, really, at year 8, year 9, year 10, pretty vulnerable people anyway as they're growing up, let alone at this particular time without all the usual supports of their mates. Particularly we're talking about men, but increasingly it's young women and girls as well. What sort of avenues are there for parents, or because there isn't all the usual checks and balances that you might have with schools where teachers pick up something that seems a bit untoward, or rather students speak to teachers about one of their mates. How do they go in a situation like this when people are at home and vulnerable?
Well, it is really tough. And we have our conventional services like Headspace, Peter, but I was absolutely delighted after taking this issue to Greg Hunt a number of months ago. We've now provided more than $500,000 in our region to set up a special suicide prevention group. So this is a group of principals, of agencies, all of the key stakeholders to work out where the gaps are. And I, in fact, went along to one of the schools affected just last week and met with a whole group of boys, and I spoke to them about the sorts of things that we could do to support them. And they were talking about things about how they wanted to get out and do environmental programs and spend time together and talk to each other. So there are more things that we can do, but it is a crisis. And as I say, I was absolutely delighted to see the announcement by the Health Minister today. We've actually spent more than $500 million on extra crisis mental health services since January. But we recognise that this is a growing problem, and it's one, I know I was talking to some of my parliamentary colleagues, it's one that we are all deeply concerned about.
Well, keep up the fight in particular for those acute care beds for young people. Thank you for the time. Thanks for discussing
Can I just mention one thing?
Yep.
Just very quickly, you mentioned about how I sought an exemption to have more than 20 people at the funeral for one of the young men who died. And I spent weeks, and you and I have spoken about this, trying to get this exemption. It was supported by Brendan Murphy, and I won't name this person, but someone very senior in the Victorian Department of Health said they would not allow it because they have a Victorian Charter of Human Rights. And I said, hang on a minute, what about the human rights of those grieving students and the impact that this would have on them if they could not gather together to mourn the loss of their friend? So something really unsettling is happening in Victoria, where the Victorian Charter of Human Rights is being cited to stop an exemption so that these young students could gather and grieve the passing of their great friend and mate. So I was absolutely horrified about that, and I really hope that that does not happen again.
And the mother of that boy, who I know very well, wanted a funeral, and she wanted a funeral with a casket so that his mates could see that suicide is final, because too many of that peer group had lost their lives. I'll have to leave it there. And please, if anyone is distressed, I want you to call Lifeline for help, 131114, or Lifeline, www.lifeline.org.au. Thank you, Sarah Henderson. Thanks for your time.